In this week's news, Google is set to reinvigorate Android One, Microsoft takes the axe to Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 starting November next year, and Apple are rumored to be producing a new 4-inch iPhone.
Welcome to Bandwidth Blog on Air. This is episode Suite 16.
Welcome to Bandwidth Blog on Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.
Right, Brian, let's get going. We've got big news from an Android front, some interesting news regarding Android One.
Well, to preface this, we don't know how this is going to impact South Africans just yet, but I think it's really exciting in that the Wall Street Journal reported today that Google is set to reinvigorate Android One, and they're doing that by relaxing the bold restrictions on manufacturers that want to create Android One devices. Now, from this, we're likely to see really, really cheap, effective, good Android phones running a simplified version of the Android OS, which will come at really, really low price points, probably likely around the $100 mark. So that'll likely result in a plus minus 1,000 Rand Android phone for the rest of us when this technology finally hits us.
Obviously, Google have realized that the only place you can really grow in terms of market saturation is in the lower end of the market. I mean, smartphones on the top end are becoming really saturated. It's just basically everybody is buying a new phone every 2 years now. There isn't a lot more people that can penetrate that market right now. Now, how do you think Google is going to do that? Obviously, they've started in emerging markets with India, and so have they penetrated any other markets? And then, of course, are they going to come to South Africa if they haven't yet?
Well, we've not heard anything really about South Africa just yet. I mean, earlier this year, which you reported on, we had the MTN Infinix, which ran Android One, and unfortunately, it never took off. Now, the real market Google are going for at the moment is actually India. Last year, they tried to release 3 Android One smartphones in India, which unfortunately, as well, just didn't take off.
Why do you think that is?
You know, I think it really came down to brand resonance, and I don't think that Google really effectively caught the Indian market at a good time, specifically with smartphones, because as we know, India is a burgeoning market, and especially there's great interest in the high-end Android phones. That being said, there's another reason as well, in that Google's first manufacturing restrictions on the Android One smartphones were really intense. I mean, manufacturers could only look, for example, to one camera supplier to supply cameras to their Android One devices. So it really put manufacturers off trying to make these really effective phones when they could just as easily make, let's say, a less effective generalized Android variant at a really low price. Which was really unfortunate to see happen, but now it looks like Google are ready to give this another shot. Now, what I want to ask you is, which manufacturers do you really think we could potentially see this coming from? I mean, there's great interest from Chinese manufacturers now in South Africa. Do you think there could be any tie-in between really cheap, effective Chinese devices and Android One?
That's a good question, and it's one that's difficult to answer, because what we've seen in India, basically 3 companies that aren't known in the rest of the world. So they targeted the local guys that were already making cheap devices, but I'm not sure that they're going to be able to penetrate somebody that's already established in the market, that's already, pumping out cheap phones of their own. So for those companies, having extra restrictions from Google in terms of what they can produce might be a little bit of a stumbling block for Google. I think they might actually partially fund some startups that will build their own smartphones. I think that's a big possibility. I'm really excited to see where it goes, though, because I mean, both of us, we love cheap phones, right? I mean, there's so much you can do with a really solid, cheap smartphone. And I mean, we discussed it the other day in Bandwidth Blog on Air when we were talking about Mixit. I mean, it's not just for feature phones. I mean that's. The CEO said that when we had to shut down because we didn't penetrate the smartphone market early enough. And that's the way the world is going with these cheaper smartphones, and it's great to see that everybody has access to that technology.
Now, this news could be seen as surprising or unsurprising depending on the way you're looking at it, but Microsoft have decided to take the axe to their offerings of Windows 7 and Windows 8.1. Microsoft have confirmed now that they plan to end sales support for Windows 7 and 8.1 in November next year, which is an incredibly close time period for 2 operating systems that aren't technically that old. Now, Theunis, where do you think Microsoft are going with this? Does this strictly line up with their plans to let Windows 10 reach 1 billion consumers?
To me, I mean, when I saw the news, I was really shocked. I couldn't believe that this was really a move that they wanted to make. I mean, we've seen them in the past support a version of Windows for up to 8 or 10 years in some instances, and even with Internet Explorer. I mean, some companies are still running Internet Explorer 7, which is also still supported, and that thing is ancient. So it's very, very interesting to see Microsoft going down this route. I actually like it. I think it's a bold step. I think Microsoft need to make bold steps these days. I actually like that, to force people to get onto this platform, because we've seen what Windows 10 is, we've seen what it can do, and we've seen that the way it's being integrated on all platforms, it just makes sense. It just makes sense for the whole world to get onto the same operating system, whether you're on your personal computer or you're at work. And actually, I think that might be the biggest problem for Microsoft, is to force people in a business sense to get onto Windows 10, because I think that's a very difficult process, especially if you're in a large company. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I think you've hit on an especially important note there, because companies now that are licensed to use Windows are still allowed, pending this new decision by Microsoft, to install whatever version of Windows they want on their PCs. So companies can even roll with Windows XP if they really, really wanted to. But from now, they'll still be able to run, large companies will still be able to run Windows 7 and Windows 8, which is going to be a really difficult thing for Microsoft to kill, because we've seen, as we know, many companies get quite stingy about updating to new operating systems because of all the compatibility issues that they might have. But on the flip side of the issue, I'm actually not horrified with Microsoft at all for doing this. I'm actually really supportive, because I think Windows 10 is the balm to many of the problems Microsoft themselves created with Windows 7 and 8.1. So I think for consumers, that's probably actually a really good move. And Windows 10, as we know, is the last official version of Windows. We're only going to see builds from here on out. I think it's a good idea that everyone start to move onto the Windows 10 platform. Well, Theunis, you and I often bemoan that there's no real smartwatch out there that can really supplant the use of a smartphone. And now it seems we found one in the form of the Rufus Cuff. What can you tell us about it?
Well, first of all, it's a horrible name. And why do companies call their devices these shocking names? I mean, who wants to name their company Rufus Labs? Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing. The Rufus Cuff is a wearable, essentially, but it's really a phone that goes on your wrist. So it's running full Android. It's got a 3.2-inch screen, which is a massive thing to carry around on your wrist. But it's essentially an Android phone, and it's got all the same functionalities you expect from the latest version of Android. The build quality looks pretty decent. Obviously, it being an Indiegogo campaign, we haven't seen it ourselves, but I mean, it would be very interesting to get our hands on it. We've always said that it would be so cool not to have a phone linked to your smartwatch the whole time. What do you think about this? I mean, other than the looks, which I think not a lot of people are going to be crazy about, but other than that, what do you think?
I'll just touch on the looks quickly before I answer that, and I think it's disappointing actually how people will probably turn that down because of the looks before they even try to test it or even purchase one themselves, because the idea, I think, is novel to bring fully fledged Android to your wrist. That being said, even personally, I don't know if I'd want something with bezels that huge on my wrist. Let's put it this way: if you were wearing a suit, it would totally disrupt the line of the suit. It would look like you had a bit of a Power Ranger thing going on underneath your tux. But that being said, I think it's a really, really cool device, and I hope it reaches its proper target on Indiegogo and it sees general release. Because
well, it has, and it's going to start selling now. It's open for pre-order. So I'm not sure what exactly the target was. It was 18 months ago, so I'll have to go check that again. But they made it pretty quickly. So there are those tech geeks like us that obviously supported the campaign.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see where that goes, because I hope, I hate to say this, but even if the Rufus Cuff doesn't take off itself, I hope somewhere a big manufacturer is watching, that at least people are interested in this and they don't want a little gimmick smartwatch on their wrist that sort of just taps into their phone every now and then and sips it like juice. We really want something powerful on our wrist to supplant what we've been carrying in our pockets for the last 5 to 10 years now.
I agree with you, but that's actually a slight problem with the Rufus Cuff, is that yes, it's supposed to replace your smartphone, but it doesn't have any cellular connectivity yet. Well, not yet, it won't ever have, it's not built in, but maybe the second iteration, the second version of it might have, then it would be a fully fledged smartphone. But they are punting it at people that are always connected to Wi-Fi basically, and that's how you'll make your phone calls.
And I think that's true. Where you're in Northern America or Europe, maybe you could survive probably off Wi-Fi quite comfortably, especially now that more and more networks are rolling out Wi-Fi calling. I think that'll be an interesting way to go. I really hope if they get to a version 2 that they bring that in, because I think it would be a killer feature. And let me put it this way: if it had cellular calling from the get-go, I think it would actually supplant the number one on my wearables want list at the moment, which is the Pebble Time Round. That's something I really want to try out personally.
Those bezels, though,
it's not that bad. Compared to the original Pebble, it's not that bad. Yeah. So if it had that cellular connectivity, that would be on my number one to try out at the moment.
Well, I would definitely like to try it out just for that geek factor and just to see how such a large device actually feels on your wrist. I mean, in the promo video that's on the website at bandwidthblock.com, you can see that some of the people wear it like a smartwatch, so how you would wear a watch on that side of your arm, but other people on the inside of the arm, and that's kind of where it makes sense to me. I mean, that's that futuristic idea we have of, being always connected and you're just lifting your arm and there would be some form of screen there. I don't know what your thoughts are. How would you wear it?
I think exactly the same, and for me personally it would come down to a privacy issue. I mean, because it would be easy for someone to spy what's going on your wrist if you're walking past them, if you're wearing it on the top of your arm. But wear it underneath, you have the potential, like I said earlier, it might disrupt this line of your suit if you're wearing one, but you have the potential to sort of tuck it in underneath your sleeve, and hence you're not such a walking target if you're walking out in an open area in the city, for example. It's there's less chance you're going to end up being relieved of it unwillingly.
Talking about taking risks, a lot of people questioned Apple's decision to drop the 4-inch iPhone when they brought out the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus, because a lot of people were very happy with the size of the phone, and I mean, Steve Jobs is quoted as saying 4 inches is perfect. Actually, he said 3.5, and then he kind of changed his mind to 4. But do you think that people were really irked by that? Because to me, it looks like everybody just went and bought an iPhone 6 anyway. But now we hear news that Apple might be bringing that form factor back.
Two thoughts on that. I think Steve Jobs was actually wrong. I
agree.
I think personally 5 inches is the way to go for me. I mean, I'm sure I'll go out on the street and hear 6 different opinions from 3 people. But that being said, I think Apple made a mistake by axing the 5C too quickly. Then again, I think the 5C was marketed in the wrong way, because Apple don't do affordable. I think it's a bad idea for Apple to get involved in anything vaguely that connotates as cheap or affordable, because they are a premium company.
And that's what plastic says to me.
Yeah, and holding the iPhone 5C, it feels like sort of the worst iPhone around. I mean, yay, it's an iPhone, it's positioned really nicely, it's much more affordable at the end of the day, depending where you are, I suppose, in international markets.
Well, much more affordable, I don't know about that, but that's another issue.
Review Spotlight, where we discuss our thoughts on the latest review devices to reach our hands.
Now, in this week's Review Spotlight, we've got another LG device. So last week we spoke briefly about the LG G4 Beat, and you published the review this week. And now we're going to talk about the LG G4 Stylus.
Now, the LG G4 Stylus is stepping in a completely different direction to the G4 Beat, where the G4 Beat is let's call it the son of the Prime G4, which is the flagship. LG have dubbed the G4 Stylus as the daughter product. Now, if you want to get over these really weird family naming conventions, everyone's siblings here. It's a bit incestuous. So now what we're looking at here is the G4 distilled into a really cost-effective phablet with a pen not unlike what you would probably end up seeing on a really early version of the Samsung Galaxy Note. And in hand, I have mixed opinions about this so far. It fits really nicely in your hand. It's a little bit wider than your average phone, as a phablet would be, and it sits really comfortably. The Rubidium Stylus, I have no clue if I'm saying that pronouncing that correctly, because I've never heard that word before, but that's what it's called. The Rubidium Stylus is really, really nice to use, and it's accurate on the screen. And I've always been a bit betwixt and between about LG's Quick Memo app, which
It's not very useful, is it?
Well, you know what? On earlier versions of Android, like KitKat, I thought it was really out of place. And it irked me that sort of if you did the Google Now swipe up from the bottom, that's right next there to Google, because I never really used it. That being said, the new stylus really makes QuickNote usable.
Okay.
And it's really, really nice to use that to jot down notes or anything. It breathes a lot of new life into QuickNote where I don't think there's been much before.
Other than Quick Memo, I mean, where would you ever really use the stylus? Because on the Galaxy Note, granted, it's a flagship device. You know, it has become quite useful to many people. So where else would you use the stylus on the LG?
Unfortunately, that's a question I can actually offer you no answer to because it's really limited to Quick Memo, which is unfortunate because the Galaxy Note is really built around the stylus. The G4 Stylus is really a product that's sort of had the stylus added as an afterthought. Really, okay. LG thought, hey, we're missing a market segment here, let's fill it up. And that's a little bit disappointing because there are no quick multitasking features like you get on the Note, which I find really, really useful. And it's disappointing in that sense. But, I mean, hey, it's a mid-range smartphone with a stylus. You don't see that too often.
No, you don't. And then the last question, what is the back like? Because LG's G4 range has become synonymous with these really nice classy backs. The LG G4 Beat you were using had a nice black leather back, and the G4 that I reviewed had the nice, the brownish color, and it felt amazing in the hand. What about the G4 Stylus?
Unfortunately, the leather back doesn't quite carry over, and I found that to be quite a disappointment because I really grew to love that with the G4 Beat. And I was really happy with LG that they brought it down to a mid-range phone. And unfortunately, the G4 Stylus doesn't get that at all. It gets a plastic 4 brushed aluminium back, sort of like what actually you would have seen on the G3 Beat or the G3 itself. My particular one is silver, which granted on its own isn't unattractive. It's a nice finish, but it definitely doesn't have the same class factor as the leather as does on the G4 and G4 Beat.
That's quite disappointing, I have to say. Sorry, I know I said last question, but this is now the last question. How does the buttons on the back feel in this much larger device? Because LG haven't released such a large device with the buttons on the back, other than the original G Flex, which, let's be honest, was not a good phone.
Well, I tell you what, the back buttons themselves aren't terribly different. They're roughly the same size. But something I don't like is that the G4 and G4 Beat had that really classy middle button that was sculpted to sort of fit your thumb when you press it down to turn the power on and off. The G4 Stylus, however, just has a single plastic press on, press off button, which is really tacky, and it really lacks the same class that LG brought to their other products.
I know you haven't used the device for so long, but do you think that you would recommend it at the price point? Do you think it's worth the price, because obviously it's a more budget-minded phone, or do you think there are other better budget-minded offerings out there?
Well, you're going to have to wait for my comparison review to hear the full answer, but I'll tell you this. If you wanted a phablet at that price point, I'd say go for it, because you're not really going to get anything too competitive at that price point. But if you were to look at it just as a smartphone on its own and sort of chuck the stylus out of the equation, the G4 Beat I found is more competitive in that realm. You'd be wanting to look at, probably at that price point, you'd be wanting to look at the Samsung Galaxy A5 or G4 Beat would be my recommendation. But again, if you want that stylus factor, the G4 Stylus would be the way to go. That's all for this week's episode of Sweet 16 of Bandwidth Blog on Air. Thank you very much for joining us.
Be sure to come back next week for episode 17, but in the meantime, be sure to go enter our Alcatel One Touch Fire E competition, and do definitely come back next week, because next week we'll be giving away a wearable. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next week on Bandwidth Blog on Air.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Blog on Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.